So what we're going to do this morning with our 6 honorees that we have, I'll introduce each one of them to you and tell you a little bit about them, and then we'll have kind of open forum where they'll tell us how they got to be so successful. What was their secret? What are their secrets to success, so to speak? So let me start off with our CEAAAs. Let's start off with Carrie Crown. Carrie's sitting right here on your left. Carrie got her Master of Science in Civil Engineering in 1987 in the area of photogrammetry. Bob Miles, you probably remember Bob Miles was here at the time. She got her BS degree in geology at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And she is currently the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, the National Geospatial Technical Operations Center. Very good. Next we have Margery Hoffman, right next to Carrie. Margery got her BSCE here in 1975. So Margery, you went through this class, right?
Yes.
Do you remember what your project was?
It was designing a small airport.
A small airport, aha, okay. Then she came back and got the Master of Science degree in the next year in '76, and in structures that was, and then you went on to George Washington University and got a Doctor of Science degree, and that was '89. You are currently the project manager for unmanned targeting air systems.
I retired last year.
What's that?
I retired in November.
Well, I wasn't going to say anything. You should really retired. Okay. All right. Very good. You are the project manager for the Unmanned Targeting Air System, retired, at the Naval Air Systems Command in Patuxent River, Maryland. Okay. Next is Trent Parkhill. Trent is right there in the middle. Trent, Master's Civil Engineer here at 82 in the Geotechnical Specialty area. Has a BS in the Geological Engineering from the University of Missouri-Rolla. And currently Senior Principal Geotechnical Engineer and Senior Fellow with Kleinfelder out of Boston, Massachusetts. Wonderful. Okay, next is Bryan Petriko, sitting right on Trent's left there. Bryan started his own company a number of years ago. But anyway, Bryan was here in 1984. Got a BSCE degree with us in the environmental specialty area. He's the owner and founder of August Mack Environmental Incorporated in Indianapolis. Okay. Dan Schuler, right on the far right end over there. Dan, BSCE in 91, hydraulics, MSCE 93, and PhD in 96 in the hydraulics realm here in civil engineering. He is the Chief Financial Officer of Aqua America Incorporated out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Formerly, he was the Executive Vice President for Strategy and Corporate Development with Aqua America. Charles Klinge. He is a colonel, retired. He's a PE, as I think some of you else are also PEs, I'm sure. Yeah. Some of you are, yes, indeed. Master of Science Civil Engineering 1998 in structures. A Chief of Operations, the Ecological Service Partner since 2016, but formerly a Commander and District Engineer of the Fort Worth District, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and also you're a West Point, right?
Yes, sir.
West Point graduate. So there we go. Those are our 6 Civil Engineering Alumni Achievement Award honorees this year. So, how many of you right now in class here have jobs? How many? Wow. How many are going on to grad school? Okay, so that's just about everybody. Very, very impressive. Very impressive. Did you see my email I sent out the other day? The US EPA in Ann Arbor is looking for people to do modeling of vehicle emissions. It was an interesting. When I get an email like that, I'll send it to the entire class. So that works out. That works out pretty well. Okay, so let's begin. I will ask each of our honorees today to kind of tell us about themselves and about how their career track is going and how they got to be so successful. So, should I just start with you, Carrie? Is that okay?
That's fine with me.
Okay, here we go. Good.
Let's see. 5 minutes or less. What did I
So good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to be here, very honored. Thank you for having me. So I guess I will talk a little bit about my path, which I think, just in case you only remember one thing, is very nonlinear. So I started after I graduated in high school, which is a long time ago, but in a 6-year medical program. So I graduated high school, I'm going to be a doctor, right? I started with the 6-year medical program. I got about 2 years into that and decided that's not what I wanted to do. So that's when I got into geology, so taking a very different path. And then graduated with my bachelor's degree in geology. I was working in construction materials testing, and got an opportunity to work for something called the Defense Mapping Agency. So this is the Department of Defense, part of the DoD that does mapping of the world. And I went to work for them in San Antonio, Texas. Worked for them for about a year and got an opportunity through them to come to Purdue and get my master's degree at Purdue. So I came to Purdue, I learned what photogrammetry was. How many of you know what photogrammetry is? A few people. So basically learning, and this is kind of an older term, but learning how to determine the position of an instrument or sensor when you're taking a measurement, right? Which is really still very, very important. But back then we were looking at airplanes and trying to determine the position of the sensor when it's a photograph of the ground. Then we were still using film, right, to take those images. So anyway, concept is still really important, and that has sort of been the core part of what has guided my career from there. So I continued to work for the Department of Defense. I went to the Washington, D.C. area after that, working for the Defense Mapping Agency, and got an opportunity to work for the U.S. Geological Survey. I took that opportunity and started working for something then called the National Mapping Division. So this is the part of the USGS that creates topographic maps. So I don't know if any of you use those topographic maps. So they are all created digitally now. We create a new map for somewhere in the United States every 3 years. We also have other programs that we're working on, including acquiring very high resolution elevation data using sensors like LiDAR sensors, so laser sensors, as well as radar-based sensors, IFSAR data. So that is, what I'm doing currently. So I'm the director of an organization. I don't get to do a lot of fun technical things anymore. So I do a lot of management, do a lot of project management still. Sort of being able now with some experience to step back and sort of see the big picture and understand where, the skills of my organization might fit in terms of helping the mission of the USGS. So I guess all in all, it's, I would just leave you with, it's not usually a linear path. I think, you take the opportunities where you have them and kind of apply those skills and things that you're interested in to the organization that you're in, and take those opportunities as they come up. So,
You mentioned project management. We have 15 engineering teams in here. Each one operates as an independent entity, entrepreneurial entity. We have a project manager for each one, and assistant. Let's have the assistant and the project manager raise their hands here. Okay, so they're beginning to learn a little bit about HR.
Oh my gosh, you don't want to ask me about that. Next.
Okay.
That's really important. Finding the right skills and the right people to do
Oh,
the job.
boy.
Absolutely important.
Yes, it
It's
is.
amazing to me how many people don't think about money. It's like that is really important. You got to think about that and the people. So those are pretty important things.
Very good. Okay, thank you. All right, Margery.
May I stand up?
You certainly may, indeed. Please do.
Okay. Well, I started out in physics, and after a couple of years, I realized I didn't really see a career path with physics. So I transferred to civil engineering here at Purdue, and one of my first classes was with Jim Yao in structural reliability. And I thought, gosh, this is really great because it's applied math, it's making buildings and bridges and systems safer.
Mm-hmm.
And it just combined everything that I wanted to do into one package. that, along with the testing of materials, understanding what materials you're working with and how they perform and where they break, failure modes, then my path was set. So I stayed for a master's in structures, and then I got a job at the Flight Dynamics Lab in Dayton, Ohio. Another thing that came into this was dynamic loading on structures. That's one thing in particular that interested me. So in the structural dynamics lab, I was able to test aluminum for airframes and watch how fast the cracks grow under constant loading and wind loading or maneuver loading. And so understanding how that material performs under stress. And it kind of all evolved from there. I also worked at Forest Products Lab in that time period. I'll break my career up into 3 phases. Forest Products Lab and Flight Dynamics Lab were in the same era of working with, in this case, lumber or wood, understanding the stiffness of it and how that relates to strength. So testing non-destructively and then seeing, it's very important to know where the knots are in the system because that's where the failures occur. So anyway, during this time period, I belonged to ASCE and National Committees on Fatigue and Fracture Reliability and ASTM testing of materials. Then I went to get my doctorate at George Washington University in probabilistic fatigue. From there, I met my husband at Patterson. He was a reserve officer. He was teaching civil engineering at Villanova University. So I ended up moving to Philadelphia and teaching 1 year at Villanova. And from there, joining Naval Warfare Center, which was located in Philadelphia at the time. And that was neat because they actually put sensors on aircraft, and you could tell from the sensors how the aircraft was flying. Was it better or worse off than the other ones flying? So we could start deciding when to make repairs based on the data and doing the calculations for fatigue reliability. And this was a time of the Cold War. The Cold War stopped, and the Navy had to keep aircraft flying a lot longer than their intended service life. So then the job moved to Pax River Naval Air Systems Command. I ended up moving into this is the 3rd phase, moving into the program offices, where I became, like you have a program manager, assistant program manager, you have the assistant engineer for the program manager. I became like the chief engineer on an MH-60R helicopter because they had dynamic component problems. So I would fit right into that job. And then from there, probably the best job of my life, I was already in my 50s by the time I got to this level, but the P3 sustainment program, where we were actually taking wings. These were never designed to be taken apart, but we took off the wings and put new wings on, not just the outer wing, but also the center wing. And that was great because I had all the technical background. I understood how the airframe was to perform and where the cracks were, and validated by now actual service life. So that morphed into the P8 program, which is the follow-on to the P3, big aircraft. It's actually a Boeing 737, modified for the Navy. And finally, when I went to retire, I had every intention of retiring. They pulled me in for the Office of Naval Research program on unmanned aircraft. So it was an unmanned targeting air system which would drop out of the P8, hunt for subs. It had a magnetometer in it. And so that was probably not directly related to structures, but because of my knowledge of the P8 and the weapon systems and the anti-submarine mission, I was right for the job. And that lasted the last 6 years.
Okay, Now, did you ever fly on one of those missions, hunting submarines?
No,
Okay.
I've been in P3s, but
Okay,
not
not that.
actual.
Okay, very, very interesting. Thank you so much. Good. And Colonel retired Charles Klinge. There you go.
Good morning, everybody. How you doing? All right, still awake? Got your coffee in? Before I start, I want to ask: is anyone in here also an ROTC student? Any ROTCers? Got one. What branch?
Army.
What?
Infantry.
Infantry. All right, I respect that. That's a very good branch. The engineers will be the ones supporting you. Make sure you can get where you need to go.
So I might go engineering in 4 years, or I might get out or stay in.
No, go engineer. Let me tell you. As Professor Jacko said, my name is Chuck Klinge. I spent 28 years in the Army after I graduated from West Point in 1988. The Army had a program that I applied and was selected to go to advanced civil schooling. That brought me to Purdue in 1997. The reason I selected Purdue is because the Army's program is, hey, whatever school you get into, we'll pay for as long as you can get in. So I applied to, all the big civil engineering names and got into all of them. I had good GREs. For an Army guy, I was pretty smart. But the thing that got me to Purdue was the reputation. So when you guys graduate, you're walking out into business with, if not one of the most prestigious engineering degrees in the country. Trust me. And the reason I went to Purdue is my father-in-law, who's in the engineering field, said, oh, Purdue, those engineers are sharp. I hire them any chance I get. I'm like, that's probably a good degree to have. So I came to Purdue. I started in summer of 97, graduated in December 1998 with my master's degree in civil engineering structures, hardcore structures. My joke, I always told people when they say, oh, well, where'd you go to school? I always say, I was trained at West Point and I was educated at Purdue. So, and there's a lot of truth to that. And part of the reason I highlighted the piece off my resume is because I wanted you guys, I kind of have a different career path from the other folks you'll see up here. I was an active duty officer. I spent almost my entire adult life in the Army. But as an engineer, I was able to use the skills that I learned here at Purdue to help facilitate both my mission in the combat engineers as well as when I work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So in the Army, the main mission of the combat engineers is to improve the survivability of friendly forces and ensure their mobility, make sure the friendly forces can get where they want to go. So the infantryman right there, there's obstacles in his way. As a combat engineer, we reduce those obstacles so he can continue his mission. And then on the flip side, what we do is we restrict the mobility of the enemy forces. Hold up the bad guys, make sure the good guys can move freely. However, since 9/11 and the global war on terror, as it used to be called, I don't even know if they call it that anymore, but the Army has gone into a counterinsurgency mission. So what they're calling on soldiers to do is a lot different than in the Cold War era, as you mentioned earlier. So this is when the skills of engineers have been really prized, because I have been tasked with stuff as a combat engineer, such as rebuilding dams, establishing power grids, rebuilding hospitals, everything to helping reestablish local governments. So it's been quite a challenge, but I think the reason the Army and our nation calls on engineers is because we have two key things. We're able to be critical thinkers, and we have problem-solving skills. And that problem-solving skills, that exactly relates to what you guys are doing here in the classroom. So I retired almost exactly 3 years ago, and now I work for a company called Ecological Service Partners. Very catchy name, ESP, we know what you're thinking. What we do in Ecological Service Partners is we do large-scale restoration of streams, wetland, and endangered habitats. So there's a goal in the country of no net loss of aquatic or endangered habitat. We're the guys on the good side of the equation who provide land that people pay for when they want to do some kind of economic development. So some developer, Department of Transportation, needs to do something that's going to affect a wetland or a stream. We find land, repair it, and they buy those credits from us. So I've been doing it for about 3 years. I enjoy it. I think I'm making a living, but I'm also doing good for the environment. As the director of operations, I often say that, people be like, well, what exactly do you do? I'm like the guy who keeps the trains running on time. I always love that because it's also a nod to my time here at Purdue, a little bit of the train analogy. But really, I think you mentioned money. As the director of operations, not only do I make sure we keep our projects on time, but we keep them in budget, because that's huge. I mean, when you're in the classroom, you may be tough, but when you're out in industry, a lot of it's about that. A lot of it's about the dollar, so always keep that in mind. As far as pathways to success, I've kind of had a little different career path, but I think a lot of that translates to you guys. First off, I would say hard work is number one. Always be willing to put in the hard work. There's no substitute for a great work ethic. Seek the tough jobs. There's a lot of jobs out there. Some will be easier than others. Seek the tough jobs that are going to provide you with the training opportunities that you think are going to further your career. And then the last thing I'd like to highlight is always find an opportunity to improve your leadership abilities. Leadership abilities are prized in private industry. The old analogy used to be that the guy who became the lead of the engineer section was the guy who was the most senior engineer, the best engineer. That's changing a little bit. They want somebody who's a qualified engineer, but who is also the best leader. So just keep that in mind as you guys go out there and seek your first job. So look forward to questions later, and thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Colonel. Appreciate
Yes, sir.
that. Okay, good. Now we'll hear from the people. See, we can't put up a building if we don't have good foundations, and Trent's going to provide them.
Yes. I've actually been interested in hearing all these backgrounds, the diversity and the way people have moved around, and I think you hear all the talk about the future and jobs changing and your generation needing to adjust and adapt, and I think this is a good example of it. So I started, as was mentioned, in geological engineering, actually, which is was pretty much like an undergraduate civil course, although some of the structures courses were ripped out, some of the water, wastewater, a few of those things were replaced with geology, which actually was a nice base. I had a professor that was my soil mechanics and foundations professor. He was really interesting and great, and that drew me over to the side. I came to Purdue. The summer before I came to Purdue, though, I got a job in a geotechnical consulting firm. I did that by sending out, 150 letters to just every address I could find. And I got a job in it. And then the summer between my 2 years at Purdue, I also had a job in a different consulting firm. So once I got done with Purdue, I actually had experience in the field, and that helped me figure out what I wanted to do or which firm I wanted to go with. My path is a little more linear. I then I ended up in Boston because for us, the company was really good for me. My wife was also looking at the same time. It was the best combination for the two of us. It was with a firm that was kind of the top geotechnical firm in the Northeast. And that turned out to be good. Boston turned out to be a good choice, and the firm turned out to be a good choice. It wasn't as obvious to me why, but highly varied geology there, which made challenges really high. Having a respected firm meant I got a chance to work on interesting projects. Stayed there for 32 years, and then 7 years ago, I picked up and switched and moved out to Utah. And I've been out in Utah for the last 7 years, which is an interesting thing to do. So I was well established. I'd moved up in geotechnical consulting firms, you start doing what you think you're going to do. You start doing analyses. And then after a while, when you're doing more than that, then you start managing projects. And then after a while, if you get really good at managing projects, you move on to managing people that manage projects. And you can find yourself moving up further and further away from the work, which I did, and got up pretty high. And then I made that switch, and I intentionally didn't take on the higher management roles, which surprised some people out there. So what I do is mentor the people who do it. There was a younger guy that was leading the geotechnical group out in the office I went to, and I thought, the best thing for me is to stay down, let him do it, and to help and me help him develop his ability to manage people and manage the group. So a lot of what I do that I really get the most enjoyment out of is hiring people. I've interviewed students recently. We've hired a couple of interns just recently and another person. And then developing people's careers, helping them figure out what's the path forward, helping them get on interesting projects. And that's another key thing I do, which is to find interesting work. So when I went out to Utah, one of the biggest challenges is, and I don't know, I asked this the other day to some grad students, so I'm going to dare ask it again today. How many of you in the room think you're introverts? Are willing to admit it? Okay, because this was interesting yesterday too, because I'm guessing the other ones that aren't raising their hand actually are just introverts. They're so introverted that you're not ready to raise your hand and say it. So, I mean, there are a few. It's a pretty small percentage in this area. I'm an introvert. I'm very much an introvert. And so one of the big challenges, I go out to a whole new area. I'm expected to be like the leading and performing really high and bringing in work, and I've got to introduce myself to new people. So I'm going to rooms full of people that I don't know and walking up to people I don't know, introducing them, trying to get their trust and convince them that they should hire me, hire my firm to do work for them. Sounds like a scary thing, but I was able to conquer it. And I guess one of the lessons I got out of that that's probably worth saying is that if you're lucky, you'll find a career path that will really challenge you, that'll throw things in front of you that you don't think you can do. And one of the things I've learned is the biggest obstacle that most of us will face is your thought that you can't do it. That is one of the things that gets in the way. A lot of us engineers, maybe not all of us, a lot of us are a little humble, on the humble side, and maybe a little even insecure, no matter how smart or how good we are. And you might tend to hold yourself back. And I guess I'd encourage you not to do that, to take risks, as was mentioned, go after difficult projects. My career, I guess in terms of success, I think the successes I'm most proud of are the engineers I helped develop. But I've been also unusual. I've had an unusual career in that I've worked on a lot of really unusual projects that are kind of first time it was ever done things. And so I've been able to be pushing the boundaries in geotechnical engineering and doing things that just haven't been done. And that's been fun. It's been exciting. All the projects have been interesting. I think how I got there is because I'm curious, and I never let go of my curiosity. I'm willing to try things that haven't been done before, and I'm a good team player. And I think that caused people to want me on their projects over the years. We work in teams and consulting firms, and so working with people, debating ideas and debating approaches to things, but then once we get done debating, coming up with, okay, this is the approach we're going to go, and everybody getting on board and doing that is, I think, maybe a strength I have that has helped me get there. So, yeah, I've been able to do a lot of unusual projects. I'm doing some stuff now. I was telling the grad students the other night that I've got a project where I was with a client, and I was telling them that it's a Superfund site, which is, so you guys might not know, it's a contaminated site. They capped it over top. Nobody could develop on top of it. They tried for like 30 years to it. And I came up with, I thought, maybe the possibility of supporting on footings on top of this site instead of piles, which would be the obvious thing. And the client asked me, well, how would you know if footings work? And so I said, well, we could run footing load tests. And he said, let's do it next week. And now, I got to admit to you, I totally made that up. I'd never heard of a footing load test in my life. And so I went back and did what you would do. I Googled it. And I found out that there have been like 2 or 3 cases where people have done this for research, but nobody's ever done it in practice. So we had to make up quickly, till now. So we had to make up quickly in the next couple of days how we were going to do these and how we could make them economic and practical. We did them. It worked. Saved the clients millions of dollars, and so we're off and running on that project. But, you know, that's a little having the courage. I mean, logically, I'm not just I'm not saying I was BSing. I'm saying that logically it seemed that if I loaded up some footings, that they would settle less than we predicted with the borings and the lab testing and all that. And having that courage to go down that road put us in some very interesting work. So I guess I would leave it at that, and like I said, encourage you all not to think about, know yourself, know what it is you're most afraid of, or know what it is you think is your weakness, and then understand that you can get around that. You can get past whatever it is you think it is, whether it's walking up and meeting new people, or it's just working with people, or any of the soft stuff, just not letting it away.
Okay, thank you very much. I love to hear you talk about teamwork, because that's the mantra here with 15 teams. It's not easy. It's not easy sometimes. So Bryan, how did you started your own business? My
I
gosh.
started my own business. Thank you. My name's Bryan Petriko. 31 years ago, I started August Mack Environmental with a partner that was a geologist. So I have a civil engineering, my Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering, and environmental focus from here. I knew my whole life that I wanted to be an engineer. When I was a little kid, I loved building models. I loved playing with Lincoln logs and erector sets. And to this day, one of the entry-level questions that we ask our interviewees is, what'd you do? What kind of hobbies did you have as a kid? Because that tells you a lot about what kind of engineer you want to be. Are you focused on the science of engineer, or are you focused on the creativity of engineering, which that's a great story. How do we solve this problem? And that's what from an environmental standpoint, I can take a lot of different engineering curriculums and figure out how to solve my environmental problem, which is not necessarily the testing and the design, but it's taking solutions and making them work for us. So from an early age, I had a passion to do two things. One, I wanted to run my own business because I had mentors or people in my family that were doing that, and that was an awesome living for them, and they looked like they were happy, and so I wanted to do that. And I had another grandfather that was a chemical engineer and was consulting all over the world. And I loved math and science and all the things that I'm sure most of you all have. So that's what I wanted. I wanted to be an engineer. At that time, I wanted to be a chemical engineer. And I wanted to run my own business. I got to Purdue. Chemical engineering, I took a few of the entry-level courses. I didn't get the chemical engineering. I didn't understand what I was going to do with that for the rest of my life. And I took a course, Introduction to Environmental Engineering, with Professor James Etzel, who's passed since. That was life-changing for me. It was just an overview of all the types of things that you could do as an environmental engineer. And I was like, I could do all those things. They're good for the earth. So there's reason for them, and I built a passion for it. And it was like, the switch clicked, and that's what I was going to do. But that's the key. You have to have a passion for what you want to do. I get up every day. I still get up today and can't wait to go and work on a project or work on the business to make it better. It's not about how many hours you work or how long it takes. It is about teamwork. That's awesome because I have 160 people on my staff that are all my team members. So you have to want to do that, and my life led me up to finding exactly what I want to do, which is really kind of cool. In addition to having the passion, you have to have commitment. And I was lucky because I have commitment to my employees. I have to serve 160 employees and make sure that their jobs are engaging, entertaining. They build a passion for them. And that's a lot of effort for that. I have a commitment to my own goals. I wanted to build a consulting firm, and I have. And then, I have a commitment to providing for my family. We have commitment to not let my partner down. I met my partner 6 months before we started August Mack. Didn't know each other well. After 31 years, he's my best friend, and I have a commitment to him because I have a job to do for him as much as he has a job to do for me. And that commitment with that passion has built something that's pretty cool. The third thing that I think is important in what we built is to have partners. And I don't mean partners that are financial or business partners. I mean partners that can teach you how to do things. We've worked a lot at August Mack with professors. Professor Jacko's worked with us. We just got done working on a project with Chad Jaffert from Purdue. We were doing a stream design. And we were trying to determine how the groundwater interface with the stream. So Professor Jaffert and a few of the students went out and did a stream study to evaluate groundwater levels and stream levels and how that impacted to see what our site was impacting the stream. Then we designed a remediation system or a containment system to prevent groundwater and coal tar from infiltrating into the bottom of the stream and the sediment, which is an awesome deal, but you need to surround yourself with partners. Early on, I surrounded myself with partners like accountants and attorneys and bankers because I didn't know how to run a business, and they could help me. We had other partners that we had to buy out, and we had to borrow a lot of money to buy out those partners 2 years after we started. And I was 28, 29 years old at that time. So I didn't know how to borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars. But we teamed up with people that we trusted that could show us how to do those things. And that's really what I learned. One of the things that I learned at Purdue is that teamwork is critical, whether it's engineering teamwork or business teamwork. It's finding the right people that can help you do the job is what gets the job done and makes a better job. So partners and making sure that you find people that you can work and debate with. I thought that was an excellent comment that you can always make a better solution if you're not doing it on your own. And then change. August Mack's changed a lot since 1988. And we started out as doing the environmental work for underground storage tanks. In 1988, the regulations came out for the first USTs. Up until that point, they were unregulated. Before 1988, everybody was pulling tanks to not have to comply with the regulations. So that was great for us. It was a great start. But 3 years later, a lot of the people doing all the tank work left. Fell out of the business because the tanks had all been pulled. There weren't a lot of, it wasn't that hard to comply with the regulations, so there wasn't a lot of consulting and engineering being done. But we had also done a lot of industrial work, and we moved into the air work. Which, another little story, I was not as lucky as most of you when I was graduating from Purdue and did not have a job yet. I had one offer, and I was still looking. And we didn't have emails to blast out when you find opportunities. So I ran into Professor Jacko in a mall, and I don't know if he probably remembers this, but he said, "Hey, do you have a job yet?" And I said, "No, not yet. I've got a couple of things that I'm looking at." And he said, "Well, call these guys."
Really? I don't
Yes.
know.
And I did. And I got that job.
Okay.
And my first job was designing air pollution control equipment for the foundry industry. So I had a big industry experience. Unfortunately, I hated that job.
You weren't supposed to say that.
But that's part of the passion. That was part of what it was about, the passion, because, I really got to the point in that position that I needed to do something else. And, I had some business desire. I still loved engineering. And I said that I'm going to give engineering another chance. And I got another job in a broader sense of environmental with my partner as my boss at that
Okay.
time, and everything clicked again. It was kind of like that feeling I had with the class that I took. It clicked, and it just worked. And so what I learned I didn't like, in the first job, I found, and I could make everybody in my company appreciate what was good. Now, not everybody in my company loves it,
Okay.
but the bad things you learn or the negative things you learn help you build what moves forward.
Okay.
And that was awesome.
I'm going to have to cut you right off
All
right
right,
now.
all right, good.
You
That's
hated
fine.
that job.
I
Go
hear
ahead
you.
and sit down.
The one thing that I did want to say is the other important thing about
Yes.
closing out is you got to give back. And when we're here today, hopefully we can give you guys back something. You've got to give back. We give back to our employees all the time. We give back to the community as much as we can. The key to success and the key to being good engineers is to provide a service that gives back. And that's the way that it all comes full circle, in my mind.
Wonderful. Bryan, thank you so much. I'll just forget the fact you hated it. Okay. Anyway, now
Well, that
Dan
was-
who's going to talk next. Dan, see, was kind of a hydraulics guy, right? And you still are, but now
Correct.
you're chief financial officer.
Correct.
How did you do that?
All right, how do we do
Gosh.
that? Yeah, and there's a tale here too. My colleagues up here all have really great stories, and I tell you, the advice they've given so far, I completely agree with all the pieces that they've shared. So how did I do that? Well, that story, how I became CFO at Aquamerica, starts at Earhart Hall. No one would have guessed that, but I lived in Fowler Courts when I was an undergraduate, which is now gone. It was right across the street from Earhart Hall. And I had my roommate, Mike Harrison, from Miami, was a management major, and he decided that even though he had Management 200 and he was supposed to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, he wasn't going to spend the money. So about 8 o'clock at night, we would go to the mail room at Earhart Hall. There'd be a whole stack of Wall Street Journals that wasn't picked up by the students in Management 200, and we'd each take one, and we'd go back to the room and we'd read them and compare stories and compare articles, and that's kind of how I got started on my trail to being more of a business guy. So started at Earhart Hall, probably doing something illegal, but let's ignore that for the moment.
Statute of limitations.
So yeah, so great undergraduate experience, a lot of work. I mean, and I was dedicated to it and spent a lot of time on it. So I wouldn't say I had the most fun experience. I didn't. I looked at the people throwing the football in front of the fraternity house and thought, I wish that were me, but it's not. In any event. So, was a residence hall counselor. Any residence hall counselors in the room? All right. Are you dating a fellow counselor by chance? Okay. If you do, you can end up married, 25 years, 6 children, all kinds of things can happen. So be careful. In any event, so great undergraduate experience. Worked for a civil engineering or geotech firm in the Chicago area. Spent my summers driving around doing soil testing and construction materials testing. Stayed for a master's in civil engineering, and then I went to work for Christopher Burke Engineering in Rosemont. And you guys probably know Chris. He comes to campus
Well, our
with some
project
frequency.
is part of it. It's in Rosemont, Illinois.
Okay.
And one of Chris did one of the studies that the students are familiar with.
Got it.
Yeah,
So I worked for Chris for a year and a half or so, and then I got a call from Dr. Rao, who was professor of hydraulics and hydrology. Asked if I wanted to come back for a PhD, and at the time we didn't have any, didn't have any commitments, didn't own a house, didn't have any obligations, no children. So okay, this is the time. So we came back and had the opportunity. I was a fellowship. I can't remember what it was called, but in any event. It allowed me to do research. It allowed me to teach. I taught 730 hydraulics, hydrology, and drainage for the land surveying majors. I worked at the physical plant, mapping the sewer network. I worked for what was called LTAP, the kind of county highway program that was in the basement of civil. So lots of things I did during those PhD years, and that interest in business continued, and that interest, generally reading the Wall Street Journal, trying to understand what's happening in the world, trying to really understand commerce was important to me. Economics, even though I've not run an economics major, something that I really like and enjoy. So when I was late in my PhD years, one of my friends, who's still a friend today, he notified me that there was a program in Krenner. It was called Applied Management Principles, and it was a kind of a 3-week mini MBA for engineering PhDs who would likely go into industry. And this is 1998. Had a great time. Totally different. All of a sudden, we're in a horseshoe-shaped room. We're having a debate, a dialogue. We're doing case studies. It was different from my undergraduate and master's PhD experience, where you're kind of like professors deriving something and you're taking notes and occasionally asking a question. So, you know, I enjoyed it immensely. And when he finished, at the end of the class, he said, well, given that it's 1998 and MBAs are all running off to join .coms, the management consulting firms were backfilling with engineering PhDs because they wanted people that were, you know, quantitative, analytical, of a certain age to work with clients and so forth. And so, I thought that sounds really interesting, so I applied to a number of firms, and you know, we had just kind of come out of the paper days, obviously, but I recall the paper days too, where you would send letters. Now at least we were sending emails looking for jobs in this era, and a firm in Greenwich, Connecticut, is actually a Paris-based firm, you know, called and said they wanted me to come and interview, and this was an interesting story too. So. The day of the interview, we got 2 small children at the time. We live on Stadium Avenue in a little place. And one of the children, who was probably 2 at the time, must have been playing with the lights in the car. So I go out at 5 a.m., click. The car won't start. I got like a 7:30 flight from Indianapolis. 5 a.m., what do? Well, you do what you would never do. Call Garrett Jong at 5 a.m. And you say, Garrett, I know you're not a morning guy, but I got a problem over here. And so Garrett shows up with the Jeep. It won't even jump start. It's dead as can be. So Garrett says, well, Susan, you drive the Jeep. You take Dan to Indy. Drop me off at home. So dropped Garrett off, went to Indy, ran to catch the flight. Drenched, absolutely drenched. Going to LaGuardia. Never been there. Interview all went well. Got the job. We thought, oh, we'll be in Connecticut a couple of years. We went, turned out 8 years in management consulting, worked in the US, in the UK, and Germany, and Spain, and France. Of course, I ended up working for a French consulting firm. When I took French, I was like, how do I just get through this and get a decent grade, but not learn it? So that, as a lesson, you know, do try to learn your language if you actually take it. So, you know, great experience, though. Worked with a lot of Fortune 100 companies, and really used my analytic toolbox that I'd learned in engineering school and applied that to a different set of problems. And that's one thing that you're leaving here with. You're leaving here with those problem-solving skills, those critical thinking skills, that analytic toolbox, which you can apply anywhere you want. And there are no boundaries to that. So did that for 8 years. Worked with PepsiCo, worked with Bausch & Lomb, United Health Group, variety of clients. Things ranging from competitive studies, market studies, sales force effectiveness, portfolio optimization, mergers and acquisitions, variety of things, supply chain projects, whole variety of things, super interesting. But at one point, after 8 years, I said, well, you know, time to do something where I'm not just giving advice to clients. And so, you know, I was looking for kind of a private equity experience, and I came across the infrastructure fund space. So this was, call it 2006, 2007. Many of the banks were starting up infrastructure funds, which is really you raise a pool of capital, you invest in infrastructure-type businesses, utilities, contracted power generation, airports, seaports, toll roads. And so I ended up joining the infrastructure fund at JP Morgan in New York, which is a commute from my house, just a train commute. And so I spent 8 years there, and that's really where I got into the utility space. So I was on the board of a gas utility that we owned, and then we took a public company private in 2010, which was a water and wastewater company, and I was responsible for that. And I spent a few years really kind of camped out in Texas, if you will, in a turnaround. So we built a board, we upgraded the management team, we exited a lot of unprofitable business, ran through some rate cases on our regulated businesses, and really turned the business around from a profitability perspective. But it also gave me the chance to really know the water space and all the industry players. So when I was then in 2015 looking for something again, I ended up joining Aquamerica, which is a publicly traded water utility. We're the second largest publicly traded water utility in the U.S., about 6 $6.5 billion market cap, about 1,500 employees. I joined to lead strategy and corporate development, and went through a strategic review and decided that there were other things we could do with our core competencies. So you mentioned Villanova University. We would go on Friday afternoons to Villanova. We'd camp out in the basement in a windowless conference room. We'd work on the strategy for the company, and out of that came this thought that our core competencies, while currently applied to water, wastewater, could be applied to other regulated utilities. And so then after that, we subsequently had pursued a few different acquisitions and announced recently that we're acquiring a large gas utility in Pittsburgh. But similar regulated utility model in states that we know, and it's really an infrastructure business, much like ours. We spend about $500 million a year in capital to upgrade, replace pipes, upgrade plants. The gas company's got about 3,000 miles of pipe to replace. So similar business. Let me give you just a couple points here, career-wise, before we move on. We talked about this skill set, the analytical toolbox you have. You can do anything you want with that. If you want to stay in engineering, technical stuff, absolutely great. If you want to go to banking, you want to go to management consulting, you want to go to law school, all open possibilities. So we shouldn't feel that we're in any way, unable to make those choices if we want coming out of Purdue. I'd say a couple things similar to what was mentioned by my colleagues here. Work hard, absolutely, every day, but put yourself in uncomfortable situations. Like take that hard project. But when you put yourself in the uncomfortable situations, those are leadership building, character building things for you. Do the right thing. Lots of times in business, and no matter what kind of business you're in, you're faced with these sort of ethical gray areas. Remember that do the right thing in all those situations is hard as it can be, and there'll be times it's not easy, right? And then finally, my takeaway would be: do something you enjoy, dedicate yourself to it, learn from your mistakes, and there will be mistakes, and be grateful.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Okay, now what we're going to do, we're not going to have time for Q&A here. So here's the deal. As you know, at 10:30 in the Wood Commons, we will all be down there in the Wood Commons, and I ask you to come on down there and ask your questions and interact with our 6 honorees. Okay? So between now and then at 10:30, work with your teams, and go Boilers, and let's thank these folks.